To Pick Computer Science video number 7, where we look at BIOS. BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System, and please don't confuse what we're going to talk about in this video with various basic input-output system models that you might have seen, which relate to how data is turned into information within computer systems. It's less to do with that in this case, it's more to do with what happens when a PC is actually switched on. So, when a computer is switched on or booted, what happens is we switch on the power. When we switch on the power, the computer's central processing unit, the brains of the computer, receives a message and knows to do what we call a BIOS post test. A power on self test, where the BIOS just checks that all of the computer's necessary hardware that it needs in order to boot up is in place. So for example, if some RAM, random access memory, was not installed in the computer, the post would probably return an error to say we haven't got all the hardware we need, and the computer would start to beep. So if you ever see a computer booted up or trying to boot up and it's just beeping at you and nothing's appearing on your screen, it's probably that your memory's not installed properly or is broken or something like that. So once the post is complete and the BIOS check is satisfied that all the necessary hardware is there, it looks for something called the MBR, the Master Boot Record. So it'll look for this on either a hard disk drive or maybe a USB data stick that might be plugged into the computer, or even a CD or DVD that's in the optical drive of the computer. And basically the master boot record just says where the operating system files live. So once it knows, then it can load up the operating system, or in particular within the operating system something called a kernel, which we'll look at in a future video. One thing that we can say about BIOS is that it stores information about a computer's hardware so that any operating system can use that hardware. For instance, Windows can use it, Linux could use it, etc. Things within that information about the hardware, settings to do with the hardware, can be changed within the BIOS. For example, you can get your processor to run at a different speed. If anybody's ever overclocked before and got its processor to run faster than it should, you have probably made a setting in BIOS. You can change hardware configurations and get your computer to not use particular hardware elements. You can change where the computer looks for the master boot record, whether it looks on a hard disk drive, a external USB data stick or DVD, for example. So how can we get to these BIOS settings to change things? Well, you'd usually, when you switch the computer on, make sure you're pressing the F2 button in good time, or possibly the delete button in good time, and then you should be taken into something that maybe looks a little bit like this simple user interface. So your computer wouldn't boot up into Windows or whatever operating system you're running. Would load up this first of all. And this is a menu-driven interface, and we'll do more about the different types of user interface in the future, but a menu-driven interface is essentially one where you can only use cursors to move around different menus and go inside menus by pressing enter, and you might be able to type in some values or maybe just select different options using your cursors and the enter key. So the sorts of information about hardware that we can see or change in the BIOS settings are things like this: the amount of RAM installed on a PC. So this lucky user will have 4 GB of RAM on their PC. It could be where the PC needs to look for the MBR. Is it the floppy drive or a CD-ROM? Is it a hard disk drive? And here is somebody changing that setting in the BIOS. Here we've got a secured BIOS, so you can actually set a password so that only you can get into your BIOS settings. And here we've got where you make that password, where you secure your BIOS. And that's something we wouldn't want you to do on college PCs, because then we'd struggle to get into the BIOS ourselves and only you would know how to get into that BIOS. So please don't set any passwords on the BIOS of the college computers. Here we've got an emulation of a BIOS interface. So this isn't actually a screenshot from the BIOS of a computer. This is actually somebody has rebuilt a BIOS interface using Flash, and this is a Shockwave Flash file that's just loaded up into a web browser. So you can actually go and inspect and play around with BIOS settings for lots of different models of computer without actually using that particular computer. If you ask your teacher, could show you where some of these BIOS interfaces are, these emulations, so you can have a play around with them for yourself. An important thing to think about for your exam would be, where is BIOS stored? Where are those settings all kept? And the answer would be not on a hard disk drive, as many people might think. Remember, we don't actually access a hard disk drive until after BIOS and post have happened. We may well not access a hard disk drive when we are loading up our MBR for the first time. The MBR might be on a CD drive, for example. So BIOS is not stored on the hard disk drive. Many people say it is stored on ROM, read-only memory, which might get people thinking a little bit, how can it be stored on something that is read-only when we are allowed to change its settings? So, strictly speaking, BIOS is stored on some form of flash memory built in to the motherboard. This might be EEPROM, electrically erasable, programmable, read-only memory, or flash ROM. These might look like those, and although they have the terms ROM within their names, which suggests read-only, they aren't actually read-only. Some aspects of BIOS could be said to be stored on CMOS, which is complementary metal oxide semiconductor, which might look like this. These types of memory aren't, strictly speaking, read-only, because values on them need to change. The time that's stored on a computer, for instance, is stored on the CMOS, and that time is constantly changing. So there needs to be some writable aspect to that little CMOS battery that's on there. And we know that BIOS settings can change, so they can't be stored on something that is read-only. One thing we can say about these is that they are non-volatile, meaning that when we switch off a computer, they keep on them what was stored on them. They don't lose anything once we pull out the power from a computer, or if we power it down. They keep it for next time the computer is booted up. To be able to define BIOS is key to your success on a BIOS question in an exam. So, what is BIOS? It needs to be said that it is machine code program. All the settings that we make in BIOS are all stored in machine code, also known as binary, but more on that another time. You just need to remember that it is machine code program. It handles low-level input and output operations, something else to remember. It provides an interface between the hardware and the operating system. That's something we've sort of talked about. It's usually provided by manufacturer on non-volatile memory. We've certainly covered that. And we say it's provided by the manufacturer because it usually comes with a motherboard when you purchase that motherboard, when you purchase your computer. We know that it can be updated in most systems, and when we say updated, we don't just mean settings can be changed, we also mean that the actual software, that user interface that you see, can be changed as well and upgraded to a newer version. And we know that some hardware configuration can be changed manually in BIOS settings, such as the processor speed. If you're interested in reading any more into any of these elements, then here might be some interesting places for you to have a look. Wikipedia's entry on the POST test, finding out more about the MBR, or the kernel in the operating system. finding out more about EEPROM, different types of flash memory, CMOS, the CP/M operating system from the 1970s might be a further point of interest to you, because this was the operating system that inspired the concept of BIOS. The CIH computer virus could be of interest to you as well. In the late 1990s, this new type of virus emerged. It was also known as Chernobyl, or space filler, and was unusual that it was able to write over the flash memory in the BIOS of some types of motherboard. As it could no longer boot, this left computers unusable and meant that the only way to fix them was by replacing the BIOS chip, the EEPROM or the CMOS or whatever. Hope that video on BIOS was useful for you. We'll see you again next time.